We're continuing our focus on environment and the Paris Agreement in focus. The Paris Climate Agreement has officially taken off today, November 4th. A historic agreement opens a new phase in the global climate governance, and its implementation is a major step in coping with the global climate change. The threshold for entry into force of the Paris Agreement was achieved on October 5th, 2016, when 97 of 197 countries that signed the agreement ratified it. Nigeria signed the agreement on September 22nd, 2016, although it is yet to ratify it. Our correspondent Ayola Kasim reports.
Mais je pense qu'il peut faire de grandes choses.
The 2015 Paris Agreement was swept back in last December by almost 200 countries, including China, the United States and the European Union, and has been described as the most complex global treaty since the Marrakesh Trade Agreement, signed in 1994. The accord passed the threshold on the 5th of October, when 55 nations accounting for more than 55% of greenhouse gas emissions, allowing it to come into force 30 days later. The Paris Agreement seeks to win the world economy of fossil fuels in the second half of the century, limiting the rise in average world temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial times. It also notes an ambition to limiting temperature rise even further to 1.5 degrees.
At a time of record heat, member states embraced this new global agreement in record time.
The World Meteorological Organization says greenhouse gases rose to a symbolic milestone in 2015, taking climate change into a new phase, which will last generations even if governments act to curb man-made global warming.
Our challenge is to sustain the momentum that has propelled the agreement into force. We remain in a race against time. But with the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the world has the plans. We need to make the shift to a low-emission, climate-resilient path.
Described as the first truly global climate pact, the agreement creates a system that encourages nations to step up voluntary domestic efforts to curb emissions and take climate action on the basis of equity and in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty.
Over the past decades, we forged a great global coalition for climate action. Government officials, scientists, faith leaders, business executives, and civil society activists around the world recognized that the future of people and planet were at stake. They made today possible.
The latest round of United Nations climate talks begin on Monday, the 7th of November in Marrakesh, Morocco, where representatives from countries will try to find ways to implement the agreement. Ayola Kasim reporting for Channels Television News.
Joining us on the news at 10 to discuss the Paris Agreement is a professor of geography, a climatologist and lead advisor to the Federal Ministry of Environment on Climate Change, Professor Emmanuel Oladapo. He joins us from our Abuja studios. You're welcome to the news at 10, Professor Oladapo.
Good evening.
Good evening. How significant is the Paris Agreement, especially to developing countries?
I'm really happy that China is really pulling its normal weight of reminding Nigerians as to the coming to force of this Paris Agreement. Even myself, I forgot until you called me today. By this agreement, many things will be happening. It's the first time that all countries all over the world are committed to one thing or the other. Prior to this, it used to be that developing nations were always asking the developed countries to talk about their own mitigation efforts, while we in the developing countries concentrate on adaptation. But with the Paris Agreement, everyone has a role to play. I just want to mention 2 or 3 things that are coming to effect right away. With this coming to force of the Paris Agreement, a governing board will be established, which is called the CMA, which is more or less Conference of Parties to the Convention, serving as a meeting of parties to the Paris Agreement. That's number one. Number two, prior to the Paris Agreement, all countries, including Nigeria, we have committed ourselves to certain things that we are going to do. We call these intended nationally determined contributions, of which Nigeria committed itself to reducing its greenhouse gas emission by about 20% under normal conditions with national support, but up to about 45% with external support. Those INDCs will now become what we call nationally determined contributions, which means we are now committed to implementing them. The third thing is that there's going to be a rule book at the meeting next week that will be finalized, which will guide the process of implementing the Paris Agreement in a very transparent manner. The importance of the Paris Agreement is that developing nations now have an opportunity of buying into a lot of the available resources, particularly the $100 billion that developed nations have pledged that they should be made available by 2020, and continue to improve upon it, because as the estimates goes, it's about $6 to $7 trillion required all over the world to mitigate the effects of climate change. So developing nations now have good opportunities of committing themselves and being able to use the implementation of the nationally determined contributions as their climate change action plans towards promoting the economy in what we call the low carbon, climate resilient, but high growth path. We can use the opportunities to propel our economy to grow very fast, but in a more sustainable manner than what we have been doing. That is the essence of the Paris Agreement. That will be a contribution to contributing to the global effort at reducing global warming to less than 2 degrees C to the pre-industrial era.
Professor, if Nigeria is not one of the 97 countries that has ratified this agreement, how are we going to benefit from it?
We've signed the agreement, and everybody saw it on the TV when the president was available in New York, and the government is very keen on ratifying it. All efforts are on ground now, and I think the legislative had been properly briefed, and I believe that it shouldn't take long after this Marrakesh meeting, the next 2 weeks, before Nigeria will ratify it. So the government of Nigeria is very, very committed, and definitely because of that commitment, we will be benefiting. For instance, even without ratifying it, the government is already putting in place what we call sectoral action plans that will help the country to implement the commitment or the contributions we have pledged in the areas of oil and gas, industry, transport, power, and agriculture, all of which we believe by the time these plans are available and are being implemented, they will govern all sectors of the economic development of Nigeria in a climate resilient manner.
Meeting which holds next month, that's COP22, holds next week, I beg your pardon. 4 issues are going to be raised in that meeting. Developing countries like Nigeria say that developed countries should fund mitigation of climate change. Do you see these developed countries like the United States and China keeping their promise?
I believe they will keep their promise because China and USA were actually one of the first 2 countries that actually ratified this agreement. And I believe with that, their commitment, they are all committed to making sure that at least $100 billion are available by 2020, which can be used to help developing nations to both in the area of mitigation and adaptation. I'm very, very positive that, but we must continue to insist that all these commitments, pledges are made in a way and manner that become very beneficial so that we do not drag the whole thing very much. I think the world has come to realize that whether we are developed or developing, we are also susceptible to the impact of climate change, and definitely there's a need for a global action to really check its impact. Whatever you do in your own country may not actually affect your country directly, but may be affecting other places. Climate change knows no political boundaries, so everybody's agreeing to the fact that global effort must be comprehensively put in place. And I believe that developed nations will fulfill their pledges of making sure that resources are available to help the developing nations to meet up to their obligations.
What a perfect way to end the conversation, Professor Emmanuel Oladapo. Thank you so much for joining us on the News at 10. We turn now to the lawmakers. The Senate has dismissed insinuation in some quarters that a frosty relationship exists between the executive and legislative arms of government. Dr. Bukola Saraki, who was addressing State House correspondents shortly after holding a meeting with the president following the Friday Jumat prayers at the presidential villa, asked Nigerians not to politicize the Senate's rejection of the president's request for foreign borrowing. He described the loan issue as work in progress. Still ahead on the News at 10, electronic payment transactions by Nigerians hit a total of 14.7 trillion naira in third quarter of 2016. We'll have more business news. Join us again.